Welcome back to Fundamentals of Philosophy. This is part 3 of lecture 7 on social justice, our last lecture. So, when we hear phrases like, the arc of history bends towards justice, what sort of claims exactly are we encountering? Jean-Francois Lyotard famously defined postmodern philosophy as a characteristic attitude of incredulity or critical skepticism towards what he calls metanarratives. A metanarrative is a comprehensive explanatory framework, a grand story that attempts to give meaning and structure to all of human history. This course has examined several challenges to entrenched metanarratives. When Bertrand Russell asks if practical knowledge is all that matters, he challenges the metanarrative of instrumental utilitarianism. When Karenyi questions whether science can ever be value neutral, he challenges the metanarrative of detached scientific objectivity. When Narayan insists that access to some types of knowledge depend upon relative social position, she challenges the metanarrative of epistemic universalism. And when Montero wonders what constitutes a physical fact, she challenges our most fundamental metanarratives about material reality itself. And as we've seen these metanarratives challenged, we've witnessed other metanarratives being born. Consider the various ways in which the search for knowledge has been presented as what John Dewey calls the quest for certainty, the pursuit of some objective standpoint, some view from nowhere, beyond all possible doubt, from which we might survey and judge the world. The empiricist grounds this certainty in the correspondence between ideas and an external reality. The rationalist locates it in the internal coherence of logical systems. But both traditions ultimately imagine a detached observer who evaluates experience from an objective standpoint positioned somehow outside of experience itself. From within the Cartesian theater, the spectral spectator sits alone, autonomous, godlike, passing judgment from a throne of speculative neutrality. And again throughout this course, we've seen various challenges to this neutral, disembodied view. In this final lecture, we're going to take a look at one of political philosophy's greatest challenges. How can we make the metanarratives that we tell ourselves about social justice make sense in a world that is built upon a concrete foundation of social injustice? So, one potential remedy for injustice is to attempt to engineer a world in which resources are distributed fairly across the entire population. This model of distributive justice was the inspiration for Rawls's original position thought experiment that we discussed in part 1. The veil of ignorance prevents us from knowing our own status within society, but from the original position we are able to observe a pattern that represents the ways in which resources are distributed throughout the world at any given moment. In this scattering of wealth and goods, we can see that some areas of the world are overflowing with resources, while other areas of the world appear mostly barren and empty. Zooming in a bit, we can see that the vast majority of resources tend to cluster around a relatively small number of people, while the majority of the world is left to divide and share the meager proportions that are left over. This distribution of goods seems obviously unfair, right? Why should a few people have more resources than they could ever use, while many, many more have barely enough to survive? The answer, from a Rawlsian point of view, is to redistribute resources in a different and more fair and rational pattern. But Robert Nozick disputes the conclusion that an unequal distribution of wealth is necessarily unfair. To illustrate this, he describes a thought experiment involving basketball star Wilt Chamberlain. Imagine that Chamberlain has signed a contract that stipulates that he will only play in games where fans voluntarily agree to pay an additional charge directly to him. And because Chamberlain's fans want to see him play, they agree to voluntarily pay this fee. Over time, a pattern emerges from these voluntary transactions. Wealth begins to flow from the fans directly to Chamberlain. From the perspective of Rawls's original position, the resulting distribution, where Chamberlain has a huge amount of wealth relative to his fans and to other players, appears unfair. But the pattern is actually the result of a series of fair transactions, right? No one was coerced. Every cent that went to Chamberlain was given voluntarily. And since the transactions were fair, the resulting distribution pattern, despite being unequal, actually represents a fair and just outcome. So what makes a transaction fair? According to Nozick, so long as you acquire your wealth fairly, then anything that you voluntarily choose to do with that wealth is also fair. These two conditions, justice in acquisition and justice in transfer, are both necessary to ensure that the resulting distribution of wealth, even if it's massively unequal, is actually fair. But there's a third principle of justice that Nozick mentions, but mostly passes over. This is the principle of rectification of injustice. It stipulates that any past injustice in acquisition must be corrected in order to establish sufficient conditions for justice. So Bernard R. Boxill is going to provide a concrete example of what Nozick's principle of rectification of injustice might look like if it were treated with appropriate seriousness. Boxill illustrates the case with a story about a bicycle. The bicycle belongs to Tom. If Dick steals the bike from Tom, then this is clearly an unjust acquisition, right? Dick owes Tom a bicycle, along with an apology and a compensation for the trouble. But what if Dick gives the stolen bike to Harry? Harry doesn't know it was stolen. From his perspective, he acquired the bike fairly. The problem is that Dick wasn't entitled to give the bike away because he didn't acquire it fairly in the first place. And since Harry acquired the bike from an unjust transfer, he isn't entitled to it either. Harry should just give the bike back to Tom, right? What if Tom dies in the meantime and leaves the bike to his son Jim in his will? Does Harry owe the bike to Jim? According to Boxill, yes, he does. The theft doesn't become legitimate just because time has passed and the original parties are dead. And here is why that's a problem for Nozick's entitlement theory of justice. Let's return to Wilt Chamberlain. The fans give their money to Chamberlain. But if the fans are American, then at least some of that money was inherited from wealth that can be traced back to slavery. And in fact, the arena where the game is being played was built on land that was originally stolen from indigenous peoples. And the entire economic infrastructure that makes professional basketball possible was built on centuries of extracted labor and colonial exploitation. Nozick's principle of rectification of injustice, when applied consistently, dismantles his entire system of justice. Nozick's project, recall, is to demonstrate that the current distribution of wealth, which massively favors some individuals over others, is actually fair and justice preserving. But justice can't be preserved if it wasn't there in the first place. And as Boxill's bicycle example illustrates, the massive concentrations of wealth that Nozick is defending are the result of historical injustices that have compounded over generations. The notion that the current distribution of wealth in America is justified is yet another founding myth. So taking Nozick's principle of rectification seriously, justice demands that we correct the original injustice which resulted in this unfair generational transfer of wealth. So how do we do that? It isn't as simple as the bicycle case, right? An entire national economy has been constructed over generations from the wealth stolen from Black American workers enslaved by white Americans. There isn't some pile of money that you can just point to and say, that's it, that's what was stolen. The stolen wealth was used to create institutions that benefited white Americans as a group at the expense of Black Americans. Education is underfunded in historically Black communities because the money that was originally stolen was then systematically redistributed towards historically white communities. And this kind of targeted impoverishment scaffolds. Without good education, career opportunities are limited. Without good economic prospects, crime increases. And increases in crime are then used as justification for the vast disproportion of black prison inmates. Then the criminal records of those inmates further limit job prospects and in many cases prevent black people from voting for policies that might redirect some of that stolen money back to black communities. And so Boxill argues that it is white people considered as a corporate entity who owe reparations, financial compensation for the rectification of historical injustices. To black Americans, they owe reparations. White people as a corporate entity owe reparations to black Americans. If Harry owes the stolen bicycle to Jim, then by that same logic, white Americans as a group owe black Americans as a group reparations for slavery. But once again, there's a problem. As Chandran Kukathas points out, the categories of race, like the related categories of personhood, have a very fluid history. Philosophers and biologists both agree that race isn't a natural category. It can't be based in genetics, it can't be based in phenotype or physical characteristics, and it hasn't remained stable over time. Irish and Italian immigrants weren't considered white when they first came to America. Jews are sometimes considered white depending on the moment and the context, but Palestinians living in the same region with the same genetic and physical markers are not. Racial categories have historically represented social and political attitudes rather than measurable scientific facts. And what about mixed race families, or recent immigrants, or groups like the Seminoles, who both enslaved Africans and fought against colonialism? There needs to be a clear, bright line between victim and perpetrator if corporate reparations are going to work either pragmatically or ethically. And according to Kukathas, no such clear line exists. And Kukathas may be right that race is a social construct. But so are money, property, and law. Social constructs, it turns out, can make a huge difference in the world. The stories we tell ourselves are powerful. In Locke's sense of powerful, they have causal power. They have the ability to make the world one way instead of another way. Stories, social constructs, and metanarratives are all technologies of world-making. The mass incarceration rate of black Americans is a real, measurable effect of a social construct. Locke's mistake was thinking that only objects are powerful. Rawls would have us ignore all of this history and focus only on redistributing existing resources in a fair and equitable fashion. That solves nothing if the institutions that reproduce the social construct remain in place. You don't eliminate poverty by dumping a bag of money over a community. You eliminate poverty by identifying the structural causes that create poverty and changing them. Ending mass incarceration might be a good place to start, along with properly funding education and social services in historically black communities. So we might also want to retire a few of the less noble lies. Meritocracy, contractualism, individualism, the post-racial society. I mean, we really don't believe in any of these anyway. Like the social contract, that they aren't really meant to be descriptions of the world. They're more like aspirations or instructions. To make the social contract real, you must continually recite the formula. Act as if you're a rationally self-interested party entering into a voluntary contractual relationship. And it's more than a formula, it's a sort of ritual, right? We reenact the illusion that we live in such a world every day in 1,000 invisible ways. We have to. Because the noble lie only works if everyone believes it. Allow a single heretic, and the whole system is put at risk. This is why the prisoners in Plato's allegory of the cave eventually murder the philosopher when he returns to liberate them. By escaping the illusion, his very existence has become a threat to the established order. Like Socrates, the escaped prisoner must be sacrificed to feed the illusion. Myth-making requires martyrs. And yet, Plato would enslave us to the very shadow play from which his philosopher martyr would liberate us, right? And what Plato crafts out of hubris, Hobbes crafts out of fear, the fear of nature. Hobbes encircles his Leviathan state with torches of reason to stave off the bloody fangs of the embodied animal beyond. Out of the state of nature, Homo economicus emerges, ready to sacrifice his liberty in order to make a deal. Here it is not a person who's martyred, but a principle. To live together, we must all agree to voluntarily euthanize some portion of our humanity. What that portion looks like remains always an object of negotiation. The rule of law, the Constitution, the separation of powers, democracy, rituals that we recite every morning and every night. It's exhausting work, holding together the narrative of the world. Tell a good enough story, and it can overwrite the world. But you have to keep telling it. Nothing less than ceaseless vigilance will preserve it. And so we tell the story. We tell the story when we go to work every morning. We tell it when we interrupt our children from play to remind them that they need to be on time to meet some deadline. We are forever renegotiating the terms of the contract and scanning our surroundings for anyone who threatens to violate it. Virginia Held thinks that it's time for a new story, a new narrative. And I agree, but I don't think that a good enough story has been written yet. That's your job. To write the story of the next generation. It's time to leave the cave and to become what Richard Rorty calls a strong poet. A writer, not just of poems, but of worlds. The myth of metals won't do, obviously, and the social contract seems to have kind of run its course lately. So what new worlds will you bear the terrible joy of writing into the book of existence? And that wraps up Fundamentals of Philosophy. You know, I always really enjoy teaching this class. I rewrite the lectures every time because I always learn something new from your responses. You're teaching me at the same time that I'm teaching you. And, you know, the fact that someone is willing to give me money to nerd out on philosophy still blows my mind, and I genuinely appreciate the opportunity to work with all of you and to read your thoughts and your responses. And I hope that at the very least, you're leaving this course with some interesting new questions to think about, and a few new tools maybe to help out towards your degree and your career beyond the university. You know, VSU was my undergrad as well, and it's a great university. So I wish you all the best of luck moving forward, and I genuinely appreciate you joining me in this course. So thank you. And good luck. See you next time.